As the howling wind hurled ice crystals against the weathered cabin windows, Thomas Randall stared at the unconscious woman on his couch, her expensive hiking gear torn and bloodied, her breath shallow in the firelight. By morning, his isolated mountain homestead would become the focal point of a corporate power struggle that would determine not just this stranger's fate, but the future of the entire Pinecrest Valley. All because one farmer chose compassion over suspicion during the season's first devastating blizzard. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The last rays of autumn sunlight filtered through the ancient pines surrounding Evergreen Homestead, casting long shadows across Thomas Randall's apple orchard. The 62 acres that had sustained 4 generations of his family spread before him, terraced fields climbing the foothills, heritage apple trees laden with varieties that had almost disappeared from commercial cultivation, and the old timber frame barn that his great-grandfather had raised with neighbors in 1936. Thomas pulled his worn flannel jacket tighter as a gust of wind carried the unmistakable scent of snow, far earlier than usual for late September in the Silverback Mountains. At 47, his weathered face and calloused hands told the story of a life spent working the land, understanding its rhythms, respecting its boundaries. The premature silver in his dark hair had less to do with age and more to do with the battles of recent years, fighting to keep Pinecrest Valley's traditional way of life intact as the outside world pressed closer with each passing season. "Going to be a bad one," he murmured to himself, eyes tracking the dark clouds gathering above the northern peaks. He had learned to read these mountains as others might read books, the way wind curled around certain ridges, how animals behaved. Before weather changes, the particular quality of silence that preceded significant storms. Today, everything pointed to conditions more typical of November than September. The barometric pressure gauge outside his kitchen window had been dropping steadily since dawn. In the valley, such an early storm might mean inconvenience. At this elevation, it could mean genuine danger. Thomas made a mental note to check on Jack Wilson, his nearest neighbor, whose arthritis would make storm preparations difficult at his 82 years. With practiced efficiency, Thomas completed his evening routine, securing equipment, bringing extra firewood to the porch, moving his small herd of Highland cattle to the sheltered eastern pasture. His border collie, Scout, worked alongside, him with the intuitive understanding that came from years as partners, rather than merely man and dog. Inside the homestead, the main house stood solid against the approaching weather. Built from local timber and stone in 1892, it had been modernized thoughtfully over generations. Solar panels on the south-facing roof, a sophisticated rainwater collection system, high-efficiency wood stoves supplementing the original fireplace. What visitors often mistook for quaint rusticity was in fact a carefully calibrated balance of traditional knowledge and appropriate technology. Thomas stoked the kitchen wood stove and placed a pot of venison stew made with meat from last fall's, hunt and vegetables from his root cellar to warm for dinner. His life followed seasonal patterns that industrial agriculture had abandoned decades ago, not from nostalgia, but from the practical wisdom of working with natural cycles rather than against them. The satellite phone chirped from its charging station, one of his few concessions to modern connectivity. Cell service remained non-existent at this elevation, and the valley's internet cooperative hadn't yet extended fiber to the outskirts. The text was from Maria Gonzalez, head of the Pinecrest Valley Community Council. Emergency meeting tomorrow 10 a.m. Summit development representatives arriving early. Documentation shows they've purchased the Bishop property. Vote on mountain water rights moved up. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. The Bishop property, 300 acres of pristine forest land that controlled access to the valley's eastern watershed. The family had promised to place it in conservation easement after Old Man Bishop passed, but his city-dwelling grandson apparently had other ideas. Summit development. The corporate giant had been circling Pinecrest Valley for 3 years, buying properties when they could, applying pressure when they couldn't. Their vision, a sprawling luxury resort with private ski slopes, wellness centers, and exclusive residences, threatened everything the valley community had built over generations. Their promises of jobs and economic revival masked the reality, transforming a self-sufficient agricultural community into a service economy dependent on wealthy visitors. Thomas replied with a simple acknowledgement, then pulled out the thick folder of water rights documentation from his desk drawer. As the valley's most knowledgeable watershed manager, a skill passed down through his family alongside farming, he had become the default authority on the complex water systems that gave Pinecrest its remarkable fertility despite its high elevation. The maps and legal documents spread across his kitchen table told a story few outsiders could read. Generations of careful stewardship had created an intricate balance of forest management, seasonal burns, erosion control, and water distribution that made the valley's sustainable agriculture possible. Summit's development plans, with their artificial snowmaking, golf courses, and swimming pools, would reshape water flows that had evolved over centuries. Outside, the first heavy snowflakes began to fall as darkness settled over the mountains. Thomas added another log to the wood stove and prepared for an evening of research. Tomorrow's meeting would require him to explain, once again, why disrupting the watershed wasn't simply inconvenient, but potentially catastrophic for the valley's future. The wind had strengthened to a howl when Scout suddenly raised his head. From the hearthrug, ears alert. A moment later, Thomas heard it too, a sound almost indistinguishable from the storm, but with a pattern that suggested human origin. 3 distinct knocks, weak but deliberate, on his front door. Thomas frowned. No one from the valley would be out in this weather, certainly not traveling up to his remote homestead after dark. The road was treacherous in good conditions. In a developing blizzard, it was nearly impassable. Scout moved to the door, not barking but alert, his posture suggesting curiosity rather than threat. Thomas grabbed the heavy flashlight from its hook and opened the door against the force of the wind. The beam illuminated a figure slumped against the doorframe, a woman, perhaps in her late 30s, dressed in high-end hiking gear now torn and bloodied. Her face was pale beneath smears of dirt and what appeared to be blood from a gash across her forehead. Most alarmingly, she clutched her right leg at an unnatural angle. "Help!" she managed, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Please." Her eyes, a striking grey-blue, focused on Thomas briefly, before rolling back as she collapsed forward. Without hesitation, Thomas caught her, noting both the lightweight quality of her expensive gear, designed for day hiking, not mountain survival, and the concerning coldness of her skin. Hypothermia had clearly set in, complicated by what appeared to be significant injuries. "Scout, move!" he commanded, carrying the unconscious woman to the couch nearest the fireplace. The border collie complied but remained vigilant, watching. The stranger with careful eyes as Thomas quickly gathered emergency supplies. Years of wilderness first aid training guided his actions. The head wound, while dramatic in its bleeding, appeared superficial. The leg was more concerning. Not broken, his careful examination suggested, but with a deep laceration that had soaked her hiking pants with blood. Most immediately life-threatening was her core temperature, dangerously low after exposure to the early blizzard. Thomas worked methodically, cleaning and dressing the leg wound, applying butterfly bandages to the head gash, wrapping her in thermal blankets, elevating her feet, preparing warm fluids for when she regained consciousness. Throughout, he maintained a calm running commentary. a habit from his search and rescue training, speaking to unconscious patients as though they could hear. You're safe now. At Evergreen Homestead in Pinecrest Valley, I'm Thomas Randall. The storm's bad, but we've got everything we need here. You've lost blood and you're hypothermic, but your injuries are manageable. It was nearly an hour before the woman stirred, her eyes fluttering open with the confusion typical of someone emerging from trauma. Thomas offered a warm, honey-sweetened tea in small sips, supporting her head carefully. "Well, where?" She managed, wincing as awareness of her injuries returned. "My farm, Evergreen Homestead. Upper eastern slope of Pinecrest Valley," Thomas answered, helping her take another sip. "I'm Thomas Randall. You collapsed at my door about an hour ago. Can you tell me your name?" She hesitated momentarily, her gaze sharpening as she appeared to make a decision. Rebecca Morgan. I was hiking and got caught in the storm, lost the trail and fell down a ravine." Thomas nodded, noting the quality of her voice. Educated, confident despite her condition, with the subtle cadence of someone who expected to be listened to. Main hiking trails are on the western slope, at least 5 miles from here. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. You're lucky to have found any structure in this weather. Rebecca attempted to sit up, grimacing as pain flared through her injured leg. I took a less traveled route. Wanted to see the eastern watershed. Clearly not my best decision. The specific mention of the eastern watershed, the very area central to tomorrow's emergency meeting, triggered something in Thomas's awareness, but he set it aside to focus on her immediate needs. That leg needs proper medical attention. Dr. Chen is the closest physician, but she's down in the valley. No one's traveling these roads tonight. Rebecca glanced toward the window, where snow now plastered against the glass, driven horizontally by wind that made the old chimney moan. "I gathered that," she said with surprising dry humor given her condition. Her gaze traveled around the cabin, taking in details with what Thomas recognized as unusually focused attention for someone in her physical state. "Your home is remarkable," she observed, eyes lingering on the hand-hewn beams, the carefully preserved original woodwork, the wall of agricultural awards and watershed management certificates. "How long has your family been here?" "Since 1892, Thomas answered, changing the compress on her forehead. "4 generations. 5th if my nephew decides farming has more future than engineering." He studied her as he worked, noting details. The high-end satellite communication watch on her wrist, the professional-grade hiking boots, the custom titanium water bottle that had somehow survived her fall. Everything spoke of someone with resources who spent time outdoors, but not with the worn familiarity of those who lived close to the land. "You need rest. I've made up the guest room, but given your condition, the couch might be better for tonight. Easier to keep the fire going and you'll need the warmth." Rebecca nodded, clearly fighting exhaustion. "Thank you. Most people wouldn't take in a bloodied stranger during a blizzard." Thomas arranged additional blankets around her. "Up here, we don't have the luxury of turning away someone in need. Weather doesn't care about suspicion or convenience." As he stood to retrieve more firewood, Rebecca's next words froze him mid-motion. "The summit development vote is tomorrow, isn't it? About the water rights?" Thomas turned slowly, reassessing the woman on his couch with new attentiveness. How would a hiker passing through know about an emergency meeting called only hours ago? Her eyes held his steadily, something like respect flickering across her features. "I do my research before hiking anywhere. The Bishop property sale was reported in the Regional Business Journal 3 days ago. It doesn't take much to connect the dots." "Not impossible," Thomas acknowledged internally, "but improbable. Particularly combined with her specific interest in the eastern watershed, the exact area central to Summit's development plans. "Get some rest, Ms. Morgan," he said finally, deliberately using her surname. "Whatever brought you to these mountains, you're safe for tonight. Tomorrow's complications can wait for tomorrow." She seemed about to say more, then nodded, settling back against the pillows. "Fair enough, Mr. Randall." Thomas added wood to the fire, then moved to the kitchen where he could observe her while preparing a proper meal for when she woke next. Something about Rebecca Morgan didn't align with the lost hiker narrative, but his immediate responsibility was to her well-being, not her motivations. Outside, the blizzard intensified, sealing Evergreen Homestead in a cocoon of howling wind and swirling snow. The satellite phone chirped again. Jack Wilson checking in, reporting nearly 18 inches already at his lower elevation property. Thomas responded, then hesitated before sending a message to Dr. Chen, describing his unexpected patient and her injuries. The doctor's response was immediate. "Stabilize and monitor. We'll try to reach you when storm breaks. Send vitals every 2 hours. Photos of injuries if possible." Thomas prepared for a long night, setting alarms to check Rebecca's condition regularly. Between monitoring sessions, he returned to the water rights documentation, making notes for tomorrow's meeting, a meeting that now seemed increasingly complicated by the presence of his mysterious guest. Around 2 a.m., as Thomas refreshed the compress on Rebecca's forehead, her eyes opened with surprising clarity. "Your maps," she murmured, gesturing toward the documents still spread across the kitchen table. "They show the underground springs network, don't they? The ones that don't appear on official geological surveys." Thomas went still. Those specific water features were known only to valley residents, particularly those passages that connected to thermal springs deep under the eastern ridge. They had been deliberately omitted from public documentation generations ago, when the first commercial interests had threatened the valley's water sovereignty. "You should focus on healing, not hydrology," he responded carefully. A slight smile crossed her features. "The two might be more connected than you think, Mr. Randall." Her eyes drifted closed again before he could respond, leaving Thomas with a deepening certainty that Rebecca Morgan was not who she claimed to be, and that her presence on the eve of the watershed vote was far from coincidental. In the early hours of the morning, as the blizzard began to subside, Thomas's satellite phone vibrated with an incoming news alert, set to notify him of any mentions of Pinecrest Valley or Summit development. The headline seemed innocuous at first. "Summit Development Executive Retreat concludes early due to weather concerns." It was the accompanying photo that caused his pulse to quicken. A group of corporate executives posed before a mountain backdrop at what appeared to be a luxury lodge about 30 miles from Pinecrest. And there, standing confidently in the center of the front row, was the woman currently sleeping on his couch. The caption removed any doubt. "Summit Development CEO Rebecca Morgan Center with executive team at Strategic Planning Retreat." Morgan's vision for the Silverback Mountains region includes the upcoming Pinecrest Valley project, pending final water rights approval. Thomas set the phone down carefully, his mind racing with implications. He had unknowingly rescued and was now sheltering the very architect of the development that threatened to transform his community forever. The timing of her hiking accident on the eve of the crucial water rights vote strained credibility beyond breaking. Had she been surveying the watershed personally, scouting locations away from public scrutiny, looking for the very underground springs network her company's geological surveys had failed to identify? Whatever her purpose, fate, in the form of an unseasonable blizzard, had delivered Rebecca Morgan into his care. The question now was what to do with this unexpected leverage as dawn approached, and with it, the meeting that would determine Pinecrest Valley's future. Thomas moved to his great-grandmother's rocking chair, positioned to allow clear view of both his patient and the eastern horizon, now beginning to lighten behind dispersing clouds. The blizzard had dropped over 2 feet of snow, extraordinary for September, transforming the landscape into a gleaming expanse broken only by the dark silhouettes of pines. Rebecca Morgan stirred as first light penetrated the cabin windows, her awakening more coherent than before. She attempted to sit up, grimacing, but managing it with careful movements. "How long was I out?" she asked, taking in the snow-covered landscape visible through the windows. "On and off through the night," Thomas answered, pouring a mug of fresh coffee and offering it to her. "Fever broke around 4 a.m. Dr. Chen will want to examine you properly, but you're past the danger point." Rebecca accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks, her gaze steady as she met his eyes. "You know who I am?" It wasn't a question. Thomas acknowledged with a slight inclination of his head. "CEO of Summit Development, the company planning to transform Pinecrest Valley into an exclusive playground for people who want wilderness views without wilderness inconveniences." He expected denial, perhaps corporate smoothness designed to manage the awkward revelation. Instead, Rebecca Morgan surprised him with a direct question. "And knowing that, you still treated my injuries, still shared your home and supplies?" "Your injuries needed treatment regardless of your job title," Thomas replied simply, "though I admit your presence here raises questions about coincidence." Rebecca set down her coffee mug and pushed back the thermal blankets, assessing her bandaged leg with professional detachment. "Not coincidence," she admitted finally. "I wanted to see the watershed personally before the final vote. Environmental impact statements and geological surveys only tell you so much. They tell you even less when they're deliberately incomplete," Thomas observed, watching her reaction closely. Something flickered across her features, frustration mingled with grudging respect. "We suspected as much. The water flow models didn't align with expected outputs. Your community has been selective, with information shared with outside entities." "Self-preservation," Thomas countered, rising to stoke the wood stove. "Pinecrest Valley has survived because generations understood that our watershed isn't just a resource to be exploited, it's a living system that requires stewardship." He turned to face her directly. "Your development would fundamentally alter water patterns that have sustained this region for centuries." Rebecca shifted, wincing as her injured leg protested. "Our environmental engineers have designed systems to minimize impact. The economic benefits to the community would be temporary and unequally distributed," Thomas interrupted. "Construction jobs would go primarily to outside contractors. Permanent positions would be service roles, housekeeping, maintenance, food service. Meanwhile, agricultural families who've worked this land for generations would be displaced by rising property taxes and diverted water resources." To his surprise, Rebecca didn't immediately counter with corporate talking points. Instead, she looked thoughtful, her gaze traveling to the wall of family photographs beside the fireplace, 4 generations of Randalls documented in their stewardship of the land. "Your community counter-proposal was unexpected," she said. And finally, "Most local resistance we encounter focuses solely on preservation. Yours actually incorporated development, just with very different parameters than our standard model." Thomas felt a flicker of cautious hope at her acknowledgement. The Pinecrest Valley Sustainable Development Initiative had been the community's response to Summit's initial proposal, not a flat rejection of change, but an alternative vision that balanced economic opportunity with environmental stewardship. "Because we're not opposed to progress," he explained, moving to the kitchen to prepare a proper breakfast for them both. "We're opposed to extraction of resources, of profit, of control. Our proposal maintains local ownership while creating Partnerships that benefit both the community and responsible investors. Rebecca watched him work, her expression unreadable. Your counter-proposal was dismissed by our development team as financially unfeasible. By your development team, Thomas noted, setting a plate of eggs, preserved venison, and homemade bread before her. But apparently not by you, or you wouldn't have mentioned it. Before she could respond, the satellite phone chirped with an incoming message. The road to Evergreen Homestead had been partially cleared by Jack Wilson's son with the community's shared snowplow. Dr. Chen was on her way up, along with Maria Gonzalez and Elijah Thompson from the Community Council. Your colleagues know where you are, Thomas asked, showing her the message. Rebecca shook her head. My team knows I went hiking yesterday. When I didn't return to the lodge, they likely assumed I took shelter in one of the park ranger cabins, or returned to the company's property via another route. She reached for the satellite communication watch on her wrist. I should contact them. Before you do, Thomas said quietly, consider this unexpected opportunity. In a few hours, you'll meet with people who actually understand this valley, not through reports or quarterly profit projections, but through generations of lived experience. People whose alternative vision your company dismissed without serious consideration. He gestured toward the window where the morning sun now sparkled across the fresh snowfall. You came here to see the watershed for yourself. Why not extend that to hearing directly from those who know it best? Rebecca studied him with the calculated assessment of someone accustomed to high-stakes negotiations. And if I agree to this spontaneous summit, what do you gain, Mr. Randall? The chance for Pinecrest Valley to be seen as more than a development opportunity, he answered honestly, for our community's knowledge to be valued alongside your company's expertise, for partnership rather than extraction. The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted their conversation. Dr. Chen's sturdy jeep, followed by Maria's truck, making their way up the newly plowed road to the homestead. The moment of decision had arrived. Rebecca Morgan straightened herself on the couch, smoothing her borrowed clothes, Thomas's sister's garments left during her last visit, practical flannel and denim that contrasted sharply with the CEO's usual, a corporate attire. Despite her injuries and unsuitable clothing, she projected remarkable composure. I'll meet with your community representatives, she decided, her voice taking on the decisive quality that had likely contributed to her corporate rise. Not as a hostage of circumstance, but as a temporarily equal party. Before my company proceeds further, I want to understand what we might be destroying. Thomas nodded, recognizing both the concession and its limits. That's all we've ever asked for, to be understood before being transformed. Bloodied. As he moved to welcome the approaching vehicles, Rebecca called after him. Mr. Randall, I'm curious. When did you recognize me? Thomas paused at the door. News alert around 4 a.m., but I suspected something wasn't aligned with your story. Much earlier. Yet you continued to provide care, knowing I represented everything you're fighting against. Thomas considered this, then answered with the straightforward honesty that characterized mountain communities where pretense rarely survived harsh winters. Up here, Ms. Morgan, we judge people first by how they respond to immediate needs, not by their job titles or future intentions. You needed help. Everything else comes after that fundamental obligation. He opened the door to greet Dr. Chen, adding over his shoulder, perhaps that's something your development models have failed to quantify, the value of communities where mutual survival still outweighs individual advantage. As Dr. Chen bustled in with her medical bag, followed by Maria and Elijah with expressions ranging from confusion to suspicion upon seeing Rebecca, Thomas felt an unexpected sense of possibility. The blizzard had delivered something no community petition or legal maneuver had accomplished, a direct audience with the person whose vision would shape their valley's future, away from corporate boardrooms and prepared statements. What would emerge from this unplanned encounter remained uncertain, but Thomas Randall had spent a lifetime reading natural patterns in weather, in seasons, in the intricate dance of water through mountain terrain. And something in Rebecca Morgan's thoughtful observation of his home, her willingness to listen rather than immediately defend, suggested that perhaps the fixed path toward Pinecrest Valley's transformation wasn't as immutable as summit developments shareholders might believe. Outside, the morning sun continued to transform the blizzard's disruption into crystalline beauty, a reminder that even the most devastating storms could reveal hidden aspects of the landscape once they passed. The next few hours would determine whether that revelation would be enough to change the course of two very different visions for the future, one measured in quarterly profits, the other in generational sustainability. Dr. Chen's examination of Rebecca's injuries was thorough and professional, though her demeanor cooled noticeably upon learning her patient's identity. The leg wound needs proper cleaning and suturing, she concluded, repacking her medical bag. The head injury appears superficial but should be monitored for concussion symptoms. Both require follow-up care, preferably at the clinic in town. I'll arrange for transportation back to our lodge, Rebecca began, but Dr. Chen shook her head firmly. Not with that leg. Movement should be minimized for at least 24 hours. You're stable, but infection risk remains high with deep tissue lacerations like yours. Maria Gonzalez, who had been observing silently from the doorway, stepped forward. The community council president was a compact woman in her 50s whose family had farmed valley orchards for 3 generations. Her normally warm features were set in guarded lines as she approached Rebecca. "So you're the CEO who wants to turn our watershed into swimming pools and golf courses," she said without preamble. "Interesting to find you injured in the home of the man leading resistance to your development." "Maria," Thomas cautioned quietly, but Rebecca raised a hand. "It's a fair observation," she acknowledged. "The timing appears suspicious, though I assure you, getting caught in a blizzard and falling down a ravine wasn't part of my corporate strategy." This unexpected touch of self-deprecation seemed to catch Maria off guard. Before she could respond, Elijah Thompson moved forward into the conversation. At 86, the eldest member of the community council carried both the formal authority of his elected position and the informal weight of being the valley's most respected elder. "I remember the last time developers came for our water," he said, his voice surprisingly strong despite his years. 1978, luxury condominiums and a championship golf course. Different company, same promises. "What happened?" Rebecca asked, genuine curiosity evident in her tone. A smile crinkled the corners of Elijah's eyes. "They found their water impact assessment was flawed. Spring thaw sent their model development pad under 3 feet of water. Turns out local knowledge about seasonal drainage patterns would have been valuable to their engineers. That oversight cost them millions," Maria added with undisguised satisfaction. "They abandoned the project rather than redesign from scratch." "Those underground springs Thomas mentioned earlier," Rebecca ventured, "the ones omitted from official geological surveys?" The 3 valley residents exchanged quick glances at this confirmation of what they'd suspected, that Summit's CEO had been personally investigating their watershed's hidden features. "Among other considerations," Thomas acknowledged, "Pinecrest Valley's water system is complex, seasonal, historical, geological factors that don't appear in standard assessments." Dr. Chen closed her medical bag with a decisive snap. "The emergency council meeting starts in 45 minutes. Summits. Representatives arrived at the community hall an hour ago, apparently confused about their CEO's whereabouts. Victoria Blackwell will be leading them," Rebecca said. "My VP of development. She's ambitious and fully committed to the original development model." "Which means," Thomas asked, "which means she has board authorization to proceed." With negotiations in my absence, Rebecca admitted. She'll push for immediate approval of water rights transfers based on the existing proposal. Maria looked alarmed. Without you there, would she have that authority? Technically, yes, Rebecca confirmed, though major alterations to the development plan would still require my approval or board intervention. Elijah leaned heavily on his carved walking stick, studying Rebecca with the penetrating gaze that had made generations of Pinecrest children confess to mischief before being asked. Ms. Morgan, I've lived in this valley for 8 decades, long enough to recognize when fortune places an opportunity in our path. Your injury and the storm have created an unexpected crossing of our respective journeys. The question is whether you'll recognize it as the same. Rebecca met his gaze steadily. What are you suggesting, Mr. Thompson? That before your corporate machinery proceeds with transforming our homeland based on incomplete information, you take this chance to understand what's at stake, not as a CEO evaluating an asset, but as a guest in our community. Thomas watched Rebecca carefully as she considered Elijah's words. Her corporate training would surely recognize the tactical disadvantage of her position, injured, isolated, outnumbered by those opposed to her company's plans. Yet something in her expression suggested genuine consideration rather than mere strategic calculation. Victoria expects me at the meeting, she said finally. My absence will raise questions about the project timeline. Good, Maria stated bluntly. Questions should be raised. Your development plan was created with deliberate blind spots, the same ones that doomed previous attempts to exploit our valley. A flash of corporate defensiveness crossed Rebecca's features. Our environmental assessments were conducted by top specialists who spent 3 days taking samples and measurements, Thomas interrupted gently. My family has been documenting water patterns here for 4 generations. Noah Parker, our local hydrologist, has 15 years of data on seasonal variations that your specialists never even requested. Rebecca's satellite watch chimed with an incoming message. She glanced at it, then looked up with an expression Thomas couldn't quite read. Victoria's asking where I am. The council meeting is about to begin. The moment of decision had arrived. The 4 Valley residents watched in silence as Rebecca Morgan, CEO of Summit Development, architect of the plan that threatened their community's future, considered her options. With a single message, she could summon corporate resources, have herself transported back to the comfort of Summit's luxury lodge, and proceed with the development as planned. Instead, she turned to Thomas. You mentioned a counter-proposal, the one our development team dismissed without serious consideration. Do you have it here? Thomas nodded, moving to retrieve a well-worn folder from his desk. The Pinecrest Valley Sustainable Development Initiative, created by our community after Summit's initial proposal, incorporating historical knowledge with appropriate development opportunities. Rebecca accepted the folder, scanning its contents with the rapid assessment of someone accustomed to processing complex information quickly. This is more comprehensive than I was led to believe, she admitted after several minutes. The water management approach alone is significantly more sophisticated than what our team developed. 4 generations of watershed stewardship, Thomas reminded her. We understand this land because our survival has depended on that understanding. Rebecca looked up, decision evident in her expression. I'd like to delay the vote on water rights transfers, she announced. Not indefinitely, but long enough to properly evaluate this counter-proposal and address the apparent gaps in our environmental assessment. The relief that passed through the room was palpable, though tempered with caution born of previous disappointments. Victoria won't accept that easily, Rebecca continued, reaching for her satellite watch. She'll argue that delays threaten the project timeline and investor confidence. A slight smile curved her lips. Fortunately, I outrank her, and a CEO's first-hand inspection of potential environmental complications is exactly the kind of due diligence our legal team would want documented before proceeding. As Rebecca composed a message to her corporate team, Thomas exchanged glances with Maria, Elijah, and Dr. Chen. A moment of cautious hope threaded with the realism of those who had seen promising opportunities evaporate before. Rebecca's willingness to pause the process was significant, but it remained far from a resolution that would protect their community's future. "Message sent," Rebecca announced, looking up from her watch. "I've instructed Victoria to request a 30-day postponement of the water rights vote pending additional environmental review. I've cited potential liability concerns based on preliminary findings during my inspection of the watershed." "Will she comply?" Maria asked, skepticism evident in her tone. "She's ambitious, not foolish," Rebecca replied. "Publicly opposing her CEO's direct instruction would damage her standing with the board." She glanced at Dr. Chen. "Now, about that follow-up care you mentioned." The doctor nodded briskly. "I can treat you here today, but you'll need proper facilities for full recovery. The clinic in Pinecrest would be best. We can monitor both the leg wound and the concussion symptoms." "Not Summit's medical team at the lodge?" Rebecca asked. "Do you want corporate doctors reporting your exact medical condition to Victoria while you're evaluating our counter-proposal?" Thomas asked quietly. Understanding dawned in Rebecca's eyes. "Point taken. The Pinecrest Clinic it is." As Dr. Chen began properly cleaning and suturing Rebecca's leg wound, Thomas's satellite phone chimed with an incoming call, a rarity given the expense of satellite voice communication. The display showed Jack Wilson's number. "Thomas?" The elderly farmer's voice crackled through the connection, concern evident despite the poor audio quality. "Summit's people just left the community hall looking none too pleased. Word is the vote's been postponed by order of their CEO. That true?" "It's true, Jack," Thomas confirmed, glancing toward Rebecca, who was stoically enduring Dr. Chen's medical ministrations. 30 days for additional environmental review. "Well, I'll be," Jack marveled. "What changed their minds? We've been pushing for that review since they first arrived." Thomas considered how to explain the extraordinary circumstances that had brought Rebecca Morgan to his doorstep, and the even more remarkable turn of events that had led to this unexpected reprieve. "Let's just say," he replied carefully, watching Rebecca, who was clearly listening despite pretending focus on her treatment, "sometimes it takes seeing things from a different perspective to recognize what's really at stake. I'll explain everything soon." As he ended the call, Thomas found Rebecca studying him with an unreadable expression. "Your community seems tightly connected," she observed. "News travels fast." "Necessity," Thomas replied simply. "When you depend on each other for survival, communication becomes essential." Rebecca nodded, wincing slightly as Dr. Chen applied antiseptic to her sutured wound. "In corporate settings, information is often treated as currency, hoarded, traded, strategically released. It creates efficiency in some ways, failure in others." This candid observation surprised Thomas. It suggested a level of self-awareness and critical analysis of corporate culture that seemed at odds with the driving force behind Summit's aggressive development strategy. "There," Dr. Chen announced, finishing the final bandage. "The sutures should hold if you minimize movement. The concussion symptoms appear mild, but someone should monitor you for the next 24 hours. Maria, who had been texting updates to the community council, looked up from her phone. "The clinic has prepared a room. Noah Parker is gathering the watershed data your team never requested. Elijah's grandson is bringing his digital mapping equipment to show the seasonal variations." Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "You moved quickly on this opportunity." "When you live with mountain weather," Thomas explained, You learn to recognize when a break in the storm offers a chance to be seized. As they prepared to transport Rebecca to the Pinecrest clinic, Thomas gathered the water rights documentation. He'd been studying the previous evening. The maps, historical records, and modern data told a story of his community's relationship with the land, a story Summit Development had approached as a simple resource transaction rather than the complex ecological and human narrative it represented. Rebecca Morgan had arrived at his doorstep as an adversary, the embodiment of external forces threatening everything he and his neighbors had preserved through generations. Yet something had shifted during her brief stay at Evergreen Homestead. Whether from necessity, curiosity, or genuine reevaluation of her company's approach, she had created a pause in what had seemed an inevitable progression toward their community's transformation. What would emerge from that pause remained uncertain. But as Thomas watched Rebecca Morgan, still in his sister's borrowed clothes, injured but maintaining the composed authority of someone accustomed to directing rather than being directed, he recognized that the blizzard had delivered something unexpected to Pinecrest Valley. A chance for two fundamentally different worldviews to see each other clearly without the filters of corporate presentations or community protests. Whether that clarity would lead to understanding, compromise, or simply a more informed conflict remained to be seen. But as morning sunlight transformed the snow-covered landscape into a dazzling panorama, Thomas allowed himself a moment of cautious hope. In his experience, true solutions emerged not from domination, but from mutual recognition of what each perspective brought to the shared challenge of living well in a complex world. The drive down to Pinecrest took longer than usual, the snow-covered road demanding careful navigation despite Jack Wilson's son's excellent work with the community snowplow. Rebecca Morgan sat in the back of Dr. Chen's Jeep, gazing out at the transformed landscape with what Thomas recognized as genuine appreciation, rather than merely evaluating its development potential. "Your valley is even more beautiful than our marketing team's photograph suggested," she observed, as they rounded a curve that revealed the full expanse of Pinecrest spread below them. A patchwork of small farms, heritage orchards, and carefully managed forest tracts surrounding the modest community center that formed the heart of local governance. "Marketing tends to flatten experience into sellable imagery," Thomas replied from the front passenger seat. "It captures the view, but misses the relationship." Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. "That's an insightful distinction. We sell the idea of mountain living without necessarily understanding what that actually entails. Like the difference between hiking through a forest and stewarding one," Thomas suggested. "Both involve trees, but the knowledge required and relationship formed are fundamentally different. Is that why your counter-proposal emphasizes limited-scale, locally managed tourism over our resort model?" Rebecca asked, referring to one of the key differences between Summit's development plan and the community's alternative vision. Thomas turned slightly to face her. "Exactly. Your model brings thousands of visitors who want to consume a mountain experience without understanding mountain realities. Our approach would bring hundreds who come specifically to learn about sustainable mountain living through guided watershed tours, traditional craft demonstrations, seasonal agricultural participation. Experiential education rather than luxury consumption," Rebecca mused. "Financially viable?" "Different revenue model, similar returns," Thomas confirmed. "Lower volume but higher per visitor value, with significantly reduced infrastructure costs and environmental impact, plus income distribution throughout the community rather than concentration in corporate ownership." Dr. Chen, who had been listening silently as she navigated the treacherous road, added her perspective. "As the valley's only doctor, I've seen what happens when communities transition to tourism-based economies. seasonal employment cycles, service industry injuries, stress-related conditions from irregular hours. Physical health follows economic health, and stable year-round employment creates healthier communities than boom and bust tourism. Rebecca absorbed this with evident interest. Our health impact assessments focus primarily on infrastructure requirements, ensuring adequate emergency services, calculating hospital bed needs. We didn't evaluate the qualitative health differences between economic models. That's the problem with most development frameworks, Thomas noted. They measure what can be easily quantified: property values, tax revenue, job creation numbers, while missing the less tangible but equally crucial elements of community well-being. As they descended into the valley proper, Rebecca observed the transformation in the landscape. What from a distance appeared as a picturesque rural community revealed itself as a sophisticated, interconnected system upon closer inspection. Solar arrays on south-facing roofs, wind turbines positioned to capture the valley's natural air currents, greenhouses engineered to maximize winter growing capacity, all integrated within the traditional agricultural framework rather than imposed upon it. Your energy infrastructure is more advanced than our surveys indicated, she remarked, pointing toward a micro-hydro installation along Clearwater Creek as they crossed the stone bridge leading into town. The Valley Energy Cooperative has been developing resilient systems for 20 years, Thomas explained. Another example of what your assessments missed: we're not resistant to technology or progress. We're selective about which innovations serve our community's long-term resilience versus which create new dependencies. The Pinecrest Clinic occupied what had once been the valley's schoolhouse, a sturdy stone building repurposed when declining. Population had forced educational consolidation a decade earlier. Its transformation represented the community's pragmatic approach to changing circumstances, preserving architectural heritage while adapting interior spaces to new needs. Noah Parker waited on the clinic steps, his lanky frame bundled against the cold, a tablet computer clutched in gloved hands. At 34, the valley's hydrologist represented a new generation of Pinecrest leadership, formally educated at prestigious universities but drawn back to apply that knowledge in service of his home community. His expression registered surprise as Rebecca Morgan emerged from Dr. Chen's vehicle, recognizing her instantly despite her borrowed clothing and injured state. "Ms. Morgan," he acknowledged with professional courtesy that couldn't quite mask his wariness. "I understand you're interested in our watershed data." "Very much so," Rebecca confirmed, as Thomas helped her navigate the icy steps. "Particularly the seasonal flow variations your models predict for the eastern watershed." Noah's eyebrows rose slightly at her specificity. "Interesting. Those exact elements were removed from the data package your team requested 6 months ago. They specifically limited the scope to current baseline measurements, excluding historical patterns and projected variations." Rebecca's expression darkened momentarily. "That decision wasn't made at my level. Our development team apparently streamlined the assessment process." "Streamlined," Noah repeated with barely concealed skepticism. "One might also say deliberately limited to avoid identifying potential complications." Thomas interceded before the exchange could grow more contentious. "We have 30 days for additional environmental review. Let's use it productively rather than relitigating past approaches." The interior of the clinic reflected the same thoughtful adaptation as its exterior. Traditional architectural elements preserved while medical technology had been integrated. Where appropriate, Dr. Chen led them to a private room where a hospital bed had been prepared alongside monitoring equipment that, while not cutting edge, was entirely adequate for Rebecca's needs. "I'll need to examine you again after you've settled," Dr. Chen informed Rebecca. Then perhaps we can discuss the health implications of watershed disruption, another factor your company's assessment overlooked. As Rebecca was helped into the hospital bed, Thomas noticed the careful way she managed her injured leg while maintaining her executive composure, a challenging balance that suggested both physical discomfort and determined self-control. Despite her borrowed clothes and medical vulnerability, she projected an authority that came from something deeper than merely her corporate position. Noah unfolded a portable workstation near her bed, connecting his tablet to a larger display mounted on the wall. I've prepared a comparative analysis showing what your environmental assessment included versus what our local monitoring has documented over 15 years. The discrepancies are significant. The door opened as Elijah Thompson entered, accompanied by a young man carrying sophisticated mapping equipment. His grandson, Michael, Thomas recognized, recently returned from graduate studies in environmental science. Behind them came Maria Gonzalez and Jack Wilson, the latter's weathered face registering subtle shock at seeing Summit's CEO in such unexpected circumstances. Rebecca Morgan surveyed the gathering community representatives with a raised eyebrow. I appear to have a full calendar for someone who's supposed to be resting. Welcome to rural medicine, Dr. Chen replied dryly, checking Rebecca's vital signs. Multitasking is our specialty. Your body needs rest, but your mind appears fully functional unless you'd prefer we postpone the watershed briefing. Thomas recognized the strategic offering, giving Rebecca an honorable exit if she felt overwhelmed or outmaneuvered. Her response would indicate much about her genuine interest in understanding their perspective versus merely managing a temporary setback to her company's plans. Rebecca adjusted herself more comfortably against the pillows, her expression resolute. Proceed with the briefing. My team has 30 days to incorporate new environmental data into our assessment. I'd like to understand exactly what they've been missing. Noah nodded, activating his display. The screen filled with a topographical representation of Pinecrest Valley, far more detailed than anything in Summit's development materials. Layered. Data visualization showed watershed patterns across seasons and years, revealing complex interconnections between surface water, underground aquifers, and forest management practices. This is Pinecrest's water system over the past 15 years, Noah explained, manipulating the display to highlight key features. What appears stable in short-term sampling actually demonstrates significant seasonal and yearly variations when viewed longitudinally. For the next hour, Rebecca Morgan received a masterclass in mountain hydrology from people whose lives and livelihoods depended on understanding its complexities. Noah's scientific expertise provided the framework, while generational knowledge from Elijah Thompson and Jack Wilson added historical context that no academic study could capture. The thermal springs beneath the eastern ridge, Noah explained, highlighting subsurface features that Summit's geological surveys had completely missed, maintain critical temperature balance in the watershed during extreme weather events. Your company's planned excavation for the resort foundation would disrupt the natural channels that have regulated water temperature here for centuries. Causing what specific impacts? Rebecca asked, her focus intense despite her medical condition. Accelerated spring melt creating flash flood conditions, Noah responded immediately. Disrupted growing seasons as soil temperatures change. Potential freezing of water sources during extended cold periods that currently remain flowing thanks to geothermal influence. Which is exactly what happened to those developers in '78, Elijah added. They disrupted the thermal channels with preliminary excavation in autumn. By spring thaw, their entire project site was underwater because the natural flow regulation had been compromised. Thomas watched Rebecca's expression as she absorbed information that directly contradicted her company's careful assessments. Rather than defensive dismissal, he observed something closer to analytical recalibration, the response of someone integrating new data into an existing framework and recognizing the necessary adjustments. Your development plan places 3 luxury condominium buildings directly atop what we call the Eastern Channel, Michael Thompson explained, using laser precision to indicate specific locations on the map. My graduate research focused on subsurface imaging techniques. We've mapped these thermal pathways with accuracy your surveyors couldn't achieve in their limited sampling period. Why wasn't this information shared during the initial assessment? Phase? Rebecca asked, looking directly at Thomas. It was considered, he acknowledged. But previous experience taught us that sharing our complete understanding of the watershed with commercial interests typically resulted in technical workarounds rather than fundamental reconsideration. Developers would adjust placement or engineering specifics while maintaining the same overall approach, treating symptoms rather than recognizing the underlying mismatch between their vision and the land's realities. Rebecca frowned slightly. So instead, you allowed us to develop plans based on incomplete information, guaranteeing complications would emerge later. We submitted the counter-proposal, Maria Gonzalez interjected firmly, which included clear statements about the watershed's complexity and offered an alternative development approach that worked with rather than against the valley's natural systems. Your team dismissed it without substantive engagement. The tension in the room increased perceptibly. Thomas recognized the critical juncture they had reached, either descending into recrimination over past communications or focusing on the opportunity the postponement had created. What matters now, he said quietly, is that we have 30 days to integrate this knowledge into a viable path forward. The question is whether Summit Development is genuinely interested in understanding this valley before transforming it, or simply in identifying technical fixes to push through your existing vision, regardless of its fundamental misalignment with the land. All eyes turned to Rebecca Morgan. Despite her injured leg, borrowed clothes, and position as a patient in a rural clinic, surrounded by those opposed to her company's plans, she maintained the composed authority that had presumably contributed to her corporate ascendance. For a long moment, she studied the watershed display, its complex patterns of blue and green illuminating her thoughtful features. Our investment in the Pinecrest project already exceeds $20 million. She finally stated. The board approved our development plan based on projected returns that depend on specific amenities and capacity. They won't simply abandon that framework because of newly discovered complications. Thomas felt the room's collective hope diminishing with each word. Then Rebecca continued, her tone shifting subtly. However, she added, neither will they approve proceeding with development that carries catastrophic environmental liability risks, particularly when those risks have been clearly documented by credentialed experts. She gestured toward Noah's display. What I'm seeing suggests our current plan is fundamentally unsound from an engineering perspective, regardless of philosophical differences about development approaches. Dr. Chen, who had been monitoring Rebecca's vital signs throughout the presentation, interjected with professional authority. Ms. Morgan needs rest. Her condition is stable, but recovery requires minimizing stress and physical exertion. Rebecca smiled slightly. Doctor's orders I won't contest, but before you all leave, I'd like to request something specific. She turned to Thomas. The community counter-proposal. I'd like Noah to integrate today's watershed data with your development framework to create a comprehensive presentation I can share with my board. Not as a theoretical alternative, but as a necessary adaptation to newly documented environmental realities. The request surprised everyone present. particularly since it represented tacit acknowledgement that Summit's original plan was no longer viable. You're suggesting a substantive shift in your development approach, Thomas clarified, based on a single day's exposure to information your team either missed or dismissed. Rebecca's response carried the decisive clarity of executive leadership. I'm suggesting we adapt to reality rather than attempt to override it. My company's interests are ultimately served by successful development, not by creating an engineering catastrophe because we refuse to acknowledge local expertise. The atmosphere in the room transformed with her words. What had been tension born of adversarial positioning shifted toward cautious, collaborative possibility. Thomas exchanged glances with Noah, Maria, and Elijah, reading their collective assessment. This represented genuine progress, though significant challenges remained. We can prepare that integration, Noah confirmed. Michael and I have already developed digital models incorporating our counterproposal parameters. We can enhance those with the specific data points that most directly contradict Summit's current engineering assumptions. Rebecca nodded, then winced slightly as she shifted position. Dr. Chen immediately moved to adjust her pillows and check her bandaged leg. "That's enough for today," the doctor declared, with the authority that made even community elders obey her medical directives. "Ms. Morgan needs proper rest, and all of you have preparations to make if you're creating a comprehensive presentation within the 30-day window." As the group prepared to depart, Rebecca caught Thomas's attention with a slight gesture. "Mr. Randall, might I have a word privately?" The others filed out, Noah already deep in discussion with Michael about data integration protocols, Maria, and Jack conferring about community notification procedures, Elijah moving with the deliberate pace of one conserving energy for important work ahead. When they were alone except for Dr. Chen, who busied herself checking medical equipment with professional discretion, Rebecca fixed Thomas with a direct gaze. "Why did you do it?" she asked quietly. "Treat my injuries, share your home, create this opportunity for reconsideration, when you could have used my vulnerable position to simply demand concessions or create leverage." Thomas considered her question carefully, recognizing its importance went beyond mere curiosity. "Because coercion doesn't create sustainable solutions," he finally answered. "Whatever emerged from exploiting your vulnerability would have been contested the moment the power imbalance shifted back. True resolution requires mutual recognition of value in each other's knowledge, concerns, and aspirations." Rebecca studied him with that penetrating executive assessment he was coming to recognize, a rapid calculation of genuineness versus strategic positioning. Whatever she determined appeared to satisfy her as she nodded slightly. "Your community is fortunate to have such philosophical leadership," she observed. "Most resistance to development projects we encounter operates from purely defensive positioning." "We've had generations to consider our relationship with this land," Thomas replied, "and with the outside forces that periodically attempt to reshape it according to external priorities, we've learned that simply saying no isn't enough. You must offer a coherent alternative vision or eventually be overwhelmed." A slight smile crossed Rebecca's features, a lesson many corporate leaders could benefit from as well. She glanced toward Dr. Chen, who was making notes in a medical chart. "How long will I need to remain here, Doctor?" "Minimum 48 hours for proper monitoring," Dr. Chen answered without looking up. "The leg wound requires regular assessment for infection risk, and concussion protocols suggest observation for at least that duration." "My team will be wondering about my extended absence," Rebecca noted. "Particularly given the postponement I've ordered without detailed explanation." "Do you regret that decision?" Thomas asked directly. Rebecca considered this. Her executive mask momentarily dropped to reveal more authentic contemplation. "No," she finally answered. Even viewing it from purely corporate self-interest, proceeding with development based on fundamentally flawed environmental assessment would have created significant liability exposure. The fact that it also allows space to consider potentially viable alternatives is a secondary benefit. Thomas nodded, recognizing the careful balance she was maintaining, acknowledging the value in reconsidering approaches without fully abandoning her corporate responsibilities and perspective. It was, perhaps, as much as could reasonably be expected from this unexpected circumstance. "I should let you rest," he said, moving toward the door. "Noah will coordinate with you on the integrated presentation. I assume you'll need to communicate with your team about your situation?" "Yes," Rebecca confirmed, "though I'll frame it carefully. Medical recovery following a hiking mishap, with the fortunate side benefit of discovering critical environmental factors our assessment missed. Corporate leadership requires maintaining narrative control, even when circumstances aren't ideally managed." This candid acknowledgement of executive communication strategy surprised Thomas with its transparency. Will Victoria Blackwell accept that narrative? A flicker of something, concern perhaps or calculation, crossed Rebecca's features. Victoria has her own vision for Summit's future direction, one that doesn't always align with my more measured approach to development. Her ambitions make her an effective VP, but also create certain challenges during situations requiring discretion or recalibration. Like discovering your flagship development project is based on fundamentally flawed environmental assumptions, Thomas suggested. Rebecca's smile held a certain wry acknowledgement. Precisely. Victoria views such complications as obstacles, to be overcome through force of will and financial leverage, not as indicators that our approach might require fundamental reassessment. She glanced at her satellite watch. I should contact her before speculation about my absence creates unnecessary complications. Thomas recognized the dismissal inherent in her shift toward corporate concerns. I'll leave you to it then. Rest well, Ms. Morgan. Tomorrow brings opportunities to build something more sustainable than either of us might have imagined yesterday. As he departed the clinic into the snow-covered village center, Thomas found himself reflecting on the extraordinary turn of events the blizzard had delivered. 24 hours earlier, he had been preparing for a seemingly inevitable confrontation with corporate forces determined to reshape his community, regardless of local knowledge or concerns. Now, through what some might call mere chance, a CEO's decision to personally inspect the watershed, an unseasonable blizzard, a hiking accident that brought adversaries together as simply humans responding to immediate needs, a new possibility had emerged. Not yet certainty, not even probability perhaps, but possibility where none had existed before. The community hall stood across the village square, its lights illuminating the gathering dusk as council members and concerned citizens continued discussions about the unexpected postponement. Thomas turned his steps in that direction, knowing his report on Rebecca Morgan's current perspective would be crucial to their planning. What had begun as a simple act of compassion, helping an injured stranger during a blizzard, had somehow created an opening for genuine dialogue between worldviews that typically spoke past each other. Whether that opening would lead to lasting understanding or merely a more informed version of the same conflict remained to be seen. But as Thomas crossed the snow-covered square, he felt cautious hope rising alongside his practical assessment of challenges ahead. In his experience, the most enduring solutions emerge not from victory of one perspective over another, but from the difficult, essential work of recognizing value across differences, seeing not merely what divided people, but what fundamental concerns and aspirations they might share despite those divisions. The community hall hummed with animated conversation as Thomas entered, snowmelt dripping from his boots onto the worn wooden floors. Conversations paused as residents noticed his arrival, faces turning expectantly toward the man who had unexpectedly hosted Summit Development's CEO during the blizzard. "Thomas!" Jack Wilson called from near the wood stove that heated the central meeting space. "We've been waiting to hear directly from you. What's happening with Morgan? Is this postponement genuine or just a corporate delay tactic?" Thomas removed his heavy coat, gathering his thoughts as he moved toward the center of the gathering. Nearly 80 community members had assembled despite the difficult post-blizzard conditions, a testament to how central the development issue was. To Pinecrest Valley's concerns, "Rebecca Morgan is recovering at the clinic," he began, deciding that straightforward information would serve best. "Her injuries are significant but not life-threatening. Dr. Chen expects she'll need to remain under observation for at least 48 hours. "And the postponement?" Mayor Robert Hayes prompted from his position near the council table. At 62, Hayes represented the moderate faction in Pinecrest politics, neither reflexively opposed to all development nor willing to sacrifice community sovereignty for promised economic benefits. "Appears genuine," Thomas assessed carefully. "Morgan has seen NOAA's watershed data and acknowledges that Summit's current development plan is fundamentally incompatible with the environmental realities their assessment missed or ignored." A ripple of surprised murmurs moved through the gathered residents. Elijah Thompson, who had arrived shortly before Thomas, added his perspective from a chair positioned respectfully near the council table. "She's requested our help integrating the watershed data with our counter-proposal," the elder explained. "Not as a replacement for Summit's plan, but as a necessary adaptation to newly discovered environmental constraints." "Can we trust her?" He called Sophia Martinez, whose family's apple orchards would be directly impacted by water flow changes under Summit's original design. "One day of seeing our data doesn't erase years of corporate development strategy." It was a fair question, one Thomas had been considering throughout his interactions with Rebecca Morgan. "Trust requires verification," he acknowledged. "Morgan still represents Summit's interests, not ours, but she's demonstrated willingness to reconsider approaches based on new information, particularly when that information reveals significant liability risks in proceeding as planned." "Good corporate self-interest," Jack Wilson observed, with the pragmatism of someone who had seen multiple development attempts come and go throughout his 8 decades in the valley. "Still, self-interest that aligns with our concerns creates room for genuine negotiation." Maria Gonzalez, who had been consulting with Noah Parker near the digital mapping display, stepped forward to address the gathering. As Community Council President, her assessment carried particular weight. "We have 30 days, she stated directly. "Not for celebration or speculation, but for substantive work, demonstrating why our approach better serves both the valley's long-term vitality and Summit's legitimate development interests." Noah and Michael are already preparing the integrated presentation Morgan requested. "What about Victoria Blackwell?" asked Peter Chen, Dr. Chen's husband, and the community's most experienced contract negotiator. Morgan's VP has been the driving force behind their aggressive acquisition strategy. Will she simply accept this change in direction? It was a perceptive question that highlighted the complex corporate dynamics at play. Thomas shared what little insight he had gained from his conversation with Rebecca. Morgan acknowledged that Blackwell has her own vision for Summit's direction, one that relies more on financial leverage and legal maneuvering than adaptation to local conditions. She's communicating with her team now, framing the postponement. as prudent risk management rather than fundamental reconsideration. Corporate politics, Mayor Hayes noted with the weariness of someone who had observed how internal power struggles often impacted external negotiations. We should prepare for resistance from Blackwell's faction, even if Morgan genuinely supports exploring alternatives. Thomas nodded agreement, which is why the integrated presentation must be impeccably documented and professionally framed, not as idealistic environmentalism, but as pragmatic risk management and opportunity realization. We're fortunate that Noah and Michael have the technical credentials to present our case in terms Summit's board will respect. Noah Parker stepped forward, his tablet displaying preliminary integration of watershed data with development parameters. Despite his youth, the hydrologist had earned deep respect throughout the community for both his scientific expertise and his commitment to applying that knowledge in service of his hometown's future. We're focusing on 3 key areas where Summit's original assessment fundamentally misunderstood the valley's hydrology, he explained, projecting his display onto the hall's main screen. The eastern thermal channels, seasonal meltwater patterns, and the interconnected nature of surface and subsurface water systems. Each represents not merely an environmental concern, but a critical engineering constraint that makes their current design physically unfeasible. Michael Thompson, standing beside his university colleague, added, "We're pairing each identified constraint with a corresponding adaptation from our counter-proposal, demonstrating how thoughtful development can proceed without compromising the watershed's integrity. The presentation will show that our approach isn't opposition to progress, but a more sophisticated understanding of what sustainable progress actually requires in mountain ecosystems." Thomas observed the community's collective response to this structured approach, the transition from reactive resistance to proactive alternative vision development. It represented exactly the shift in strategy they had been working toward over the past 3 years, ever since Summit's initial land acquisitions had signaled their development intentions. Mayor Hayes summarized the emerging consensus. "We use these 30 days to finalize our integrated proposal, documenting exactly why Summit's current approach is fundamentally flawed and how our alternative better serves both community preservation and appropriate development. If Morgan is genuinely open to reconsideration, we provide her the comprehensive justification she'll need to shift her company's direction. And if she's not?" Sophia Martinez pressed, giving voice to the cautious skepticism many still felt. Despite the promising developments, Elijah Thompson answered with the quiet authority of someone who had witnessed multiple generations of similar challenges. "Then we'll be better prepared for the legal and regulatory battles ahead, having thoroughly documented the environmental liabilities their current plan entails. Either way, this unexpected opportunity strengthens our position." The discussion continued well into evening, transitioning from community-wide information sharing to focused working groups addressing specific aspects of the integrated proposal. Thomas moved between these groups, contributing his multi-generational knowledge of the watershed, while observing with appreciation how quickly his neighbors had adapted to this unexpected shift in circumstances. What struck him most profoundly was the absence of vindictive positioning or triumph at Summit's setback. Instead, he witnessed genuine engagement with the possibility of finding solutions that might actually serve both the valley's long-term vitality and the development company's legitimate interests. Not surrender of core values, but recognition that sustainable progress required integration of seemingly opposing perspectives rather than victory of one over another. As the meeting gradually disbanded, residents departing into the cold night, with specific assignments and renewed sense of purpose, Thomas found himself alongside Elijah Thompson near the hall's entrance. The elder studied him with the penetrating gaze that had guided the community through multiple challenges over his long lifetime. "You've changed her," Elijah observed quietly. "Rebecca Morgan, something in her perspective has shifted during her time here." Thomas considered this assessment carefully. Perhaps the blizzard simply created space for her to acknowledge complexities her corporate process was structured to overlook. Elijah smiled slightly. "When I was a young man, my grandfather taught me that mountains don't primarily change people through their harshness. They change people through their beauty by revealing what truly matters when artificial separations are stripped away." He gestured toward the clinic visible across the square, its windows warmly lit against the darkness. "You didn't just rescue a CEO caught in a blizzard. You showed her Pinecrest through eyes that see its true value, not as resource to be exploited or obstacle to be overcome, but as relationship to be honored." "That's a generous interpretation of offering basic medical assistance," Thomas replied, uncomfortable with the implied significance of his actions. "Is it?" Elijah countered gently. "You could have treated her injuries while maintaining rigid boundaries. Instead, you shared your home, your meals, your understanding of this land we steward together. You treated her as person first, corporate, representative second, and in doing so, invited her to see our community as living human ecosystem rather than development opportunity." Before Thomas could formulate a response to this unexpectedly philosophical assessment, Noah Parker approached, with his tablet displaying new modeling results. "Thomas, we need your input on the integrated water flow projections," the young hydrologist requested. "The historical patterns you've documented for the northeastern seep system don't align with our current measurements. We need to understand if we're seeing normal variation or something that might impact the alternative development footprint." Thomas nodded, grateful for the return to practical matters. "I'll review the historical records tomorrow. My great-grandfather documented significant shifts in that system following the earthquake of 1932. We might be seeing echo effects in the current patterns." As Noah departed with this information, Elijah placed a weathered hand briefly on Thomas's shoulder. "Rest well, young Randall. Tomorrow brings new work in this unexpected opening you've helped create." The elder smiled slightly. Sometimes compassion accomplishes what confrontation never could, not by overcoming opposition, but by momentarily dissolving the boundaries that make us forget our shared humanity. Thomas watched the community elder make his careful way down the snow-cleared path toward his home, considering the wisdom in his perspective. While he wasn't ready to claim his spontaneous assistance to Rebecca, Morgan represented anything more profound than basic mountain ethics, helping those in need. Regardless of their identity or intentions, he couldn't deny that something significant had shifted during her time at Evergreen Homestead. Whether that shift would translate into meaningful change in Summit's approach remained uncertain, but as Thomas turned toward his own homeward path, he acknowledged that perspective transformation had to precede policy transformation. And for a brief, unexpected moment during the blizzard, corporate CEO and mountain farmer had seen each other not through the distorting lens of adversarial positioning, but through the clarifying experience of shared humanity. It was, perhaps, a beginning worth building upon, not with naive optimism that ignored real conflicts of interest and perspective, but with grounded hope that acknowledged common ground might exist beneath those genuine differences. The night air carried the sharp clarity that follows significant snowfall, stars emerging in brilliant constellations above the valley. As Thomas made his way home, footsteps crunching in the hardening snow, he found himself wondering what Rebecca Morgan might be thinking as she recovered in Pinecrest's clinic, surrounded by the community her company had approached as mere development. Opportunity now dependent on their care while reconsidering the assumptions that had guided her project from its inception. Corporate leadership required maintaining certain narratives, as she had candidly acknowledged, but narrative coherence became challenging when direct experience contradicted fundamental assumptions. The coming days would reveal whether this unexpected intersection of different worlds would produce lasting understanding or merely temporary recalibration before returning to established patterns of conflict. Thomas reached Evergreen Homestead as full darkness settled over the mountains. Scout greeted him with canine enthusiasm, the border collie's routine undisturbed by the extraordinary human developments unfolding around him. The farmhouse stood solid against the night, generations of careful stewardship embedded in its sturdy construction and thoughtful adaptations. As Thomas stoked the wood stove and prepared a simple evening meal, he recognized that what had begun as routine storm preparation had somehow become a pivotal moment, not just for his unexpected guest, but potentially for the entire community whose future hung in the balance of decisions made in corporate boardrooms, far from the mountains that shaped their daily lives. The watershed maps still lay spread across his kitchen table where he had been studying them before Rebecca Morgan's arrival. Physical documentation of relationships his family had observed and recorded through 4 generations of attentive stewardship. Tomorrow, these would be integrated into Noah's digital presentations, translated into the technical language Summit's engineers and executives would respect. But tonight, as Thomas settled into his great-grandmother's rocking chair near the fire, he reflected on the more fundamental translation that might have begun during the blizzard, the translation of values and perspectives across worldviews that typically struggled to recognize validity in each other's basic assumptions. Outside, the mountain night continued its ancient rhythms, indifferent to human concerns, yet profoundly shaping them through its implacable realities. Whatever emerged from this unexpected convergence of corporate strategy and community preservation would ultimately need to align with those realities rather than override them. A truth Rebecca Morgan seemed to be acknowledging, at least in this moment of vulnerability and reconsideration. Whether that acknowledgement would withstand the pressures of corporate expectations and shareholder demands remained to be seen. But as Thomas prepared for rest, he allowed himself to appreciate the unexpected opening that compassion during crisis had somehow created. Not resolution yet, certainly, but possibility where none had existed before. And in his experience, possibility properly nurtured could sometimes grow into outcomes neither side had initially imagined possible, not through conquest of one perspective over another, but through the challenging, essential work of creating something new that honored what was truly valuable in each. The morning sun cast long shadows across Pinecrest Valley as Thomas made his way toward the clinic, carrying a basket of fresh provisions from Evergreen Homestead. The past 48 hours had transformed both the landscape and the community's immediate future, blankets of unseasonable snow gradually yielding to autumn sunshine, while Summit Development's seemingly unstoppable momentum had paused for environmental reassessment. Inside the clinic, he found Rebecca Morgan significantly improved from the injured hiker who had collapsed on his doorstep during the blizzard. Though still confined to her hospital bed per Dr. Chen's orders, she had established a makeshift workspace around her. Tablet computer, satellite communication devices, and printouts of Noah Parker's watershed data arrayed across the bedding, like tactical maps before a campaign. "Mr. Randall," she greeted him with the poised professionalism that seemed integral to her character regardless of circumstances. "Your community has been remarkably accommodating during my unexpected stay." "Hospitality doesn't require agreement, only humanity," Thomas replied, setting the basket on the side table. "Fresh eggs, apple preserves, and sourdough bread from this morning's baking, Hospital food rarely satisfies, even in the finest urban facilities. A genuine smile momentarily replaced her executive composure. Thank you. Dr. Chen's care has been excellent, but the meal options reflect rural medical budget constraints. Thomas noticed the satellite phone beside her tablet, its notification light blinking with unread messages. Your corporate team seems eager for communication. Victoria has sent 17 messages since yesterday, Rebecca confirmed with a slight grimace, ranging from concerned about my well-being to increasingly pointed questions about the postponement. Rationale: the board has called an emergency session for tomorrow morning to review the situation. Before Thomas could respond, Noah Parker entered carrying additional watershed modeling results. The young hydrologist nodded greeting to Thomas before addressing Rebecca directly. The seasonal flow projections you requested, he explained, transferring files to her tablet. Historical data overlaid with projected climate variation models for the next 50 years. The Eastern Ridge thermal channels show particularly concerning vulnerability to disruption. Rebecca studied the new data with focused attention, her expression shifting from executive neutrality to genuine concern. This gradient shift would effectively undermine the foundation engineering for our entire Eastern development sector. Even with reinforcement, the ongoing maintenance costs would be prohibitive. Noah nodded, which is precisely what we've been trying to communicate since Summit first expressed interest in Pinecrest. The valley's hydrology creates specific constraints that conventional development approaches can't override, not through engineering or capital investment. Yet our assessment team concluded otherwise, Rebecca noted, her tone suggesting internal reconsideration rather than defensive positioning. Because they measured what they expected to find, Thomas observed, rather than what actually exists. Brief observation periods, narrowly defined parameters, assessment protocols designed for more conventional terrain. Rebecca set down the tablet, meeting Thomas's gaze directly. You sound remarkably understanding of corporate environmental assessment limitations for someone who has spent years opposing our development. Understanding limitations isn't the same as accepting their consequences, Thomas replied, particularly when those consequences threaten generations of community stewardship because of hasty evaluation processes. Rebecca acknowledged this with a slight nod before returning her attention to Noah. These thermal channel models, have they been independently verified? The board will question data that contradicts our paid consultants' conclusions, especially coming from sources aligned with opposition to our development. Rather than taking offense at the implied skepticism, Noah responded with professional confidence. My doctoral research at MIT focused on subsurface hydrothermal mapping techniques. The methodology we've used here has been peer-reviewed in 3 scientific journals. Michael Thompson's graduate work at Stanford provides additional validation through different measurement approaches that reached identical conclusions. Rebecca absorbed this with evident reassessment of her assumptions about rural expertise. I'd like both methodology papers included in the presentation materials. Credentialing context matters when challenging established corporate assumptions. The conversation continued as Noah walked Rebecca through specific technical constraints that Summit's original plan had failed to account for. Thomas observed their interaction with quiet appreciation for how quickly adaptations were occurring on both sides. Rebecca engaging with local expertise without corporate condescension, Noah presenting community concerns in technically rigorous terms rather than merely impassioned opposition. As Noah departed to continue data integration work, Rebecca turned her attention back to Thomas. Your community has developed a sophisticated approach to engaging with developers. Technical expertise paired with generational knowledge, alternative vision rather than mere resistance. Necessity teaches effective strategy, Thomas replied. We've faced development pressure periodically for decades. Each round has refined our approach. Yet Summit's resources exceed anything you've previously encountered, Rebecca noted. Our legal team alone has more personnel than your entire community council. True, Thomas acknowledged, which is why we've focused on fundamental feasibility rather than regulatory or legal maneuvering. No amount of legal expertise or capital investment can overcome basic hydrological realities. A slight smile touched Rebecca's features. An elegant approach. Target the foundation rather than the superstructure. Their conversation was interrupted by Dr. Chen, arriving for morning rounds, her professional demeanor efficiently assessing Rebecca's physical recovery while maintaining the careful boundaries appropriate between healer and patient who represented potentially opposing interests. The sutures are healing properly, she concluded after examining the leg wound. No signs of infection. The concussion symptoms have resolved. You'll need to minimize physical exertion for another week, but you're cleared to return to your corporate responsibilities, assuming you can arrange appropriate transportation. Thank you, Doctor, Rebecca replied. Your care has been exemplary. I hope Summit can find ways to support Pinecrest's medical services, regardless of how development discussions proceed. It was a diplomatic gesture that acknowledged ongoing negotiations without making specific commitments. Dr. Chen recognized it as such, responding with professional courtesy rather than either gratitude or skepticism. Quality rural healthcare benefits everyone who values these mountains, she observed, gathering her equipment, whether as residents, visitors, or developers. After the doctor departed, Rebecca addressed the practical considerations her medical clearance presented. My team will want to retrieve me immediately. Victoria has already arranged helicopter transport from the community landing pad, pending my confirmation. Thomas noted how quickly corporate resources mobilized when executive interests were involved. Convenient that Summit maintained helicopter access while questioning the feasibility of improving road infrastructure to lower-income sections of the valley. Rebecca acknowledged the implicit criticism with surprising candor. Resource allocation reflects priorities, a reality in both corporate and community contexts. The question is whether those priorities are transparently determined and equitably implemented. She typed briefly on her tablet, then set it aside with the decisiveness Thomas had come to recognize as characteristic of her leadership style. I've requested the helicopter for tomorrow morning rather than today. I'd like to meet with your community council first. See your counter-proposal presentation in its current form before bringing it to my board. This unexpected extension of her stay in Pinecrest suggested genuine engagement rather than merely professional courtesy. Thomas considered its implications carefully. The council is meeting this afternoon at 3. Noah and Michael planned to present the integrated watershed models for community feedback before finalizing the presentation for Summit. Perfect, Rebecca declared. I'll attend, not to evaluate or judge, but to understand your collective perspective before advocating for its consideration at the corporate level. Thomas raised an eyebrow at this framing. You're positioning yourself as advocate for our perspective? That's a significant shift from Summit's previous approach. Rebecca adjusted herself more comfortably against the pillows, her expression suggesting internal recalibration rather than strategic positioning. My responsibility as CEO is ensuring Summit's sustainable success, financial, environmental, and reputational. What I've learned here suggests our original development approach jeopardizes all three dimensions through fundamental misalignment with Pinecrest's actual conditions. And Victoria Blackwell shares this reassessment? Thomas asked, remembering Rebecca's previous comments about her VP's different vision for Summit's direction. A brief shadow crossed Rebecca's features. Victoria prioritizes quarterly metrics and shareholder expectations over longer-term considerations. Her approach has delivered consistent short-term returns, which the board naturally appreciates. My more measured perspective sometimes appears overly cautious by comparison. Until environmental realities validate that caution, Thomas observed. Precisely, Rebecca agreed, which is why documenting these watershed constraints through credentialed expertise is essential for shifting our corporate direction, not as concession to opposition, but as prudent risk management and opportunity optimization. The satellite phone chimed with incoming messages, corporate demands penetrating even this remote mountain clinic. Rebecca glanced at it but didn't immediately respond, instead returning her attention to Thomas. Will the council accept my presence at their meeting? I understand if they prefer to finalize their approach without the corporate perspective they're ultimately addressing. B. It was a surprisingly thoughtful question that acknowledged power dynamics Rebecca might typically overlook from her executive position. Thomas considered it seriously before responding. They'll accept it, he finally concluded, not without caution, but with recognition that direct dialogue serves our interests more effectively than filtered communication through legal and corporate channels. As they continued their conversation, the unexpected intersection of their different worlds seemed to offer genuine possibility where none had existed before, not through conquest of one perspective over another, but through the challenging, essential work of creating something new that honored what was truly valuable in each. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.